The facts are very, very clear. The United States is heading toward a debt crisis. The only solutions will be truly painful for us all. That doesn't have to be our future. The way we respond to this challenge will ultimately define our generation. We can choose a path to prosperity. Let's take a look at how we can do it. Our debt as a share of the economy is already too high, but look at where it's going. These are actually pretty conservative estimates. We face a crushing burden of debt, which will take down our economy. It will lower our living standards. Actually, I asked the Congressional Budget Office to model the economy going forward. So they have these computer programs that simulate the U.S. economy. The computer program crashes in 2037 because it can't conceive of any way in which the U.S. economy can continue because of this massive burden of debt. You know, the economists tell us, when your debt gets to 90% as a share of your economy, you start slowing down and we stagnate. We prevent that from ever happening.
Is Paul Ryan's approach, dead on arrival, is it the wrong argument to be having?
Well, I think he's wrong to say no matter what happens and no matter what the circumstances are, we won't touch taxes. I've already said, you know, I wouldn't be against lowering the corporate rate as long as you didn't lose money by making sure everybody paid something. But Ryan's position is whatever tax rates exist now are perfect as compared with anybody paying $1 more. The only way to make the tax system more perfect is to have it produce less revenue. And I think that's wrong.
So what do we do? Well, we could increase taxes massively. But to raise the kind of money we'd need, we'd have to significantly increase taxes on everybody, especially the middle class. That means taking a lot more money out of your paycheck and mine. Because if you think we could get what we need from the rich, well, think again. If we took all the earnings of people who make more than $1 million, a 100% income tax, that would only net us a little more than $600 billion. And obviously, we could only do that once.
We don't have a problem with these deficits and debt because people don't pay enough taxes. The problem with our deficit and debt is because Washington spends far too much money. We're spending all this money we don't have, and it's that spending that is the core root cause of our problem.
People say that the government has a debt problem, but debt is an effect. The cause is deficits. Every time the government runs a deficit, the debt increases. If the debt is like the outstanding balance on a government's credit card, the deficit is the extra amount the government charges on its card each year. Debt is caused by deficits, but deficits are caused by the difference between tax revenue and spending. So perhaps the debt problem is really a revenue problem. How much tax revenue has the government collected over time? Federal tax revenue today is more than 20 times what it was in the 1950s. But that's not a fair comparison. Prices are a lot higher than they were in the 1950s, so let's adjust tax revenues to account for inflation. Adjusted for inflation, tax revenue is more than 5 times what it was in the 1950s. But that's not a fair comparison either. There are a lot more people in the United States than there were in the 1950s. So let's adjust tax revenues to account for population growth. Adjusted for inflation and population growth, tax revenue today is 3 times what it was in the 1950s. This suggests that the government does not have a revenue problem. If the debt is caused by deficits, and deficits are caused by revenue and spending, and if the government does not have a revenue problem, then that means that the debt problem is really a spending problem. Since 1954, the average price level has risen 700%. How does that compare with government spending? Over the same period, the per-person cost of government has risen 3,000%. To put that in perspective, the government recently attempted to take over the healthcare industry in an attempt to rein in the rising cost of healthcare. But since 1954, the average cost of healthcare has risen only 2,000%. This suggests that we would have been better off to ask physicians to reform government than to ask politicians to reform healthcare. The lesson here is that we don't have a government debt problem or even a budget deficit problem. We have a spending problem. This means more tax revenue won't solve it. In fact, it will make it worse, because no matter how robustly our tax revenues grow, government always finds a way to spend everything it collects, plus more.
The president is proposing to raise the top tax rate on these small businesses to 44.8%. We don't think that's good for jobs. We don't think that's good for economic growth. And when we tax our employers a whole lot more than our foreign competitors tax theirs, we lose, they win, and we don't want that. So just like the Fiscal Commission, the Bipartisan Fiscal Commission said, lower tax rates, broaden the tax base for economic growth, and that's exactly what we're proposing.
I guess the part that I don't quite understand, and I take your proposal to be a serious one, but the part I don't understand is,
Thank you.
If the country is going bankrupt, if the country needs to borrow 40 cents of every dollar that it spends, how do you help that by reducing the amount of taxes that the richest people in the country pay? It would seem to me that's where you get revenue. How do you justify
Two
that?
things. Two things. Number one, we don't have a tax problem. Our revenues are going back to where they have been historically. We have a big spending problem. Spending is growing at a very unsustainable rate. So let's focus on spending. The other thing I would simply say is massive tax increases. The president's proposing $1.5 trillion in tax increases. The Democrats in Congress are proposing anywhere from $2 to $16 trillion in tax increases based on the 3 budgets they brought to the floor the other day. We don't want to slow down the economy. Here's what we're trying to get. Spending cuts and controls to get spending under control, because that's the problem, and economic growth and job creation. We don't want to give up one to get the other. Raising tax rates on anybody, especially successful small businesses, slows down the economy, loses jobs, and if you have lower economic growth, you have less revenues, and it puts you further behind.
Will the Republicans agree to raise any taxes at all? And if not, where do you see the compromise?
We don't think tax increases is a good idea, both for job creation, for economic growth, and we don't want to take the pressure off where it needs to be, which is spending. We don't have a revenue problem in Washington. We have a spending problem in Washington. If you actually try to fix this through tax increases, you will literally crash the economy.
Can you bring yourself to say the President of the United States and Congressman Paul Ryan agree about the serious economic situation that this country faces? We agree that there is an economic crisis unless we do something about our debt, and all we have is two people, two ideas that are in collision about what to do about it, because he has in this speech and recently recognized that there have to be spending cuts. That was part of the deal that was made recently. So the president seems to be saying, I understand we've got to cut spending. I understand the problem of the deficit, but we simply have a difference of opinion to get to essentially the same numbers.
Well,
Reduction of $4 trillion in 10 years.
I don't think that's correct. I mean, here's why I say this, Charlie, and with all respect to the president, we put out an actual plan. We put out a specific plan that does what we say it will do, that pays off this debt, that balances the budget, that gets the economy growing and preserve Medicare, Medicaid, the safety net, and all of those things. The president has given us speeches, he's given us platitudes, and he's given us commissions. Right. He hasn't given us a plan to fix this. His own budget, according to the Washington Post, punts and ducks on this issue. So he has yet to give us an actual plan that actually fixes the problem. So we don't have competing plans. We really don't have competing ideas. We have an actual plan that we have put out there using our principles of growth and opportunity and prosperity, of welfare reform, and we have his speeches. We don't have a plan. So you really can't say that there's plan A and plan B. Let's split the difference. There's plan A, our plan, and there's no other plan from the president.
Why do you think he's not offering more specifics?
I don't know. I honestly don't know.
Here's what would happen under our proposed budget, what we're calling the path to prosperity. As you can see, we won't come anywhere close to the tipping point, and we'll pay off the debt over time. So how will we do it? We will cut spending. Washington's unsustainable spending is driving the nation's permanent plunge into debt. Look at the growth of government under the current path we are on. The government grows to such high levels that by the time my 3 children are my age, the government will be twice the size for them than what it is for me. Our plan brings spending back down to the historic level of 20% as a share of our economy. Washington has not been telling you the truth. If we don't reform spending on government health and retirement programs, we have zero hope of getting our spending and, as a result, our debt crisis under control. Next year, the government spends 68 cents out of every dollar you pay in taxes just to pay for these health and retirement programs and interest on the debt. By the year 2025, they will consume every penny of every tax dollar you send to Washington. Our budget saves and strengthens these programs. It fixes the flaws in Medicare and Medicaid that have made rising costs nearly impossible to check. This is the only way these programs can hope to survive and function into the future.
He says the following, the fact is their vision is less about reducing the deficit than it is about changing the social compact. But it makes this point over and over about your proposal, coming at you head on. He says there is nothing serious about a plan that claims to reduce the deficit by spending $1 trillion on tax cuts for millionaires and billionaires. There's nothing courageous about asking for sacrifices from those who can least afford it and don't have any clout on Capitol Hill. And also, this is not a vision of the America I know, said the president.
Does that sound like a leader who's trying to bridge partisan gaps? Does that sound like a leader who's trying to get the two parties to come together for bipartisan solutions? Or does that sound like somebody who just relaunched his election campaign, who's making partisan arguments? I'll let you be the judge of that.
Let me ask you two other quick questions. Revenues, even some people who like what you're doing with regard to cuts, like Alice Rivlin, like some Republican senators who have said, you know, who compliment what you're doing, their view is that you can't just go after entitlements, you also need to deal with revenues. And they're saying you're not doing that in the essential way that one needs to.
Sure. So, I think that's probably an accurate description. I don't think raising taxes is a good idea in this economy. We need to have economic growth and job creation. Raising taxes on businesses at a time when they're struggling to compete in the international economy doesn't work.
Congressman Ryan, is there any tax role for reducing our $1.4 to $1.7 trillion deficit this year? Is there any role in tax increasing to help do that job?
I don't think it's a good idea, especially when we're trying to come out of a jobless recovery in a slow growth economy. Look, we got employment almost 10%. The last thing we should be doing is raising taxes on the economy. Look, Chris, the worst thing for deficit reduction is a slow economy. You hit small businesses with these kinds of tax rate increases and you'll slow down the economy further. Look, 75% of those who will get hit with these higher tax rates are successful small businesses. Tens of millions of our jobs come from these small businesses. Now, if you try to blame these tax cuts and the wars for all of our fiscal problems, the numbers just don't add up. At best, 14% of the evaporation of the surplus came from these tax cuts. It all came from other circumstances, spending, economic growth declining, 9/11, all these other things. So I think what Joe earlier said is right, which is these taxes will go up, and I think that's a mistake, and I think it's going to hurt the economy.
Class warfare, I will grant you, can be good politics. Exploiting people's emotions of envy, fear, and anxiety can make for good electoral outcomes. But I got to tell you, Charlie, it's really bad economics. We need to be competitive globally. We tax our businesses a whole lot more than our foreign competitors tax theirs.
More borrowing and spending and higher taxes are not going to bring jobs back to America. The last thing we need to be doing is to complicate job creation in America with this complicated tax code we have today. A tax code should be fair, competitive, and simple. And the U.S. tax code fails on all three counts. Here are common sense ideas we've advanced before and that have bipartisan support. First, we have to make our tax code fair. It's full of deductions, credits, and special carve-outs, otherwise known as loopholes, that let politically connected companies avoid paying taxes. Every dollar that companies spend lobbying for a better tax deal is a dollar they're not spending making a better product. And since every dollar hidden in a loophole doesn't get taxed, politicians make up for this lost revenue by increasing overall tax rates. So we need to close these loopholes. But if we just close loopholes, then our federal corporate tax rate is 35%. Add in state and local taxes, and the rate climbs to over 39%, the second highest tax rate among developed countries. On top of sending almost 40 cents out of every dollar earned straight to the government, businesses pay investment taxes, payroll taxes, and a handful of other taxes government makes job creators pay. In the 21st century global economy, And when American families need jobs, this approach just doesn't make any sense. We need to make our tax code competitive. The budget we passed in the House of Representatives calls for closing loopholes and lowering tax rates. The President's Bipartisan Fiscal Commission proposed something similar. The Commission's plan would reduce corporate tax rate to as low as 26% and lower the top individual rate that many small businesses pay to as low as 23%. So if we lower tax rates, does that mean the wealthy pay less in taxes? Not if we do it by closing loopholes, because the people who use most of the tax loopholes are those who are in the top tax brackets. For all the money that's parked in these tax loopholes, all that money is taxed at zero. Take away the tax loophole, lower everybody's tax rates. That money's now taxed, but it's taxed at a fairer, more simple, more competitive way, so the small businessmen and women who are out there striving and competing have a better tax rate that they can compete in this global economy. Third, let's make our tax code simple. Individuals and businesses spend over 6 billion hours and $160 billion every year just trying to understand and comply with the tax code. Let's simplify the tax code, not just by closing loopholes, but also decreasing the number of different tax brackets taxpayers fall in. Fewer brackets, along with lower individual rates, will make the tax code less complicated and let more people keep more of the money that they earn. There's a reason this approach has bipartisan support. It's fair, it's competitive, and it's simple. America's been knocked down before, we've had tough recessions before, and we know that the secret to growing jobs and prosperity in America are through the ingenuity and the hard work of our businesses, of our small businesses, of our large businesses, of job creators. We don't want a tax system that rewards people for coming to Washington and getting special favors. We want a tax system that rewards Americans for hard work, risk-taking, entrepreneurship, and investment in innovation. These are the kinds of things that have made America great in the past. And these are the kinds of ideas that we're going to need if we want to grow our economy in the future and compete in the 21st century global economy.
He has said, as you know, and even alluded to in this speech, that he wants to reduce the corporate tax. At the same time, he wants to do the corporate tax, right?
Right. But you got to remember, Charlie, most of the jobs come from small businesses who don't file their taxes as corporations. They file their taxes as individuals. So I agree with him on corporate tax reform. So does the Fiscal Commission. There's one area where we seem to have some agreement, but on the class warfare side, you can't get jobs if you go after job creators. You got to remember, almost 3/4 of our jobs come from small businesses, and they are the ones who pay the individual tax rates. He is proposing in his budget, to raise the top tax rate on these successful small businesses to 44.8%. You throw state income tax on top of there, and you are taxing the job creators of America at over 50% in this country. And when our competitors are taxing theirs at about 25%, they win, we lose. We want jobs, we want prosperity, and with higher economic growth and more job creation, you get more revenues to the federal government, and that helps us with our deficits, and that's the path we want to go.
Let me ask you, Congressman Ryan, you have no problem defending tax cuts for people to make over $250,000 a year.
Small businesses, go to Wisconsin, drive to our industrial
individuals.
parks.
It's an individual tax cut.
You have to understand, Chris, 75% of those people who pay that top tax rate are small businesses who file as individuals, not corporations. That's the problem with this economic argument, Chris, is when you think you're just taxing rich people like Bill Gates, what you end up doing is you're hitting successful small businesses. When we tax our employers more than our foreign competitors tax theirs, they get our jobs and we lose in global competition. So we ought to be keeping our eye on economic growth and job creation, what's necessary to do that, and that means low tax rates on businesses and small businesses and certainty. We have a whole new tax uncertainty that's hurting economic growth. We need to give taxpayers certainty that they're not going to have a huge wave of tax increases in 2011 and then another one in 2013. Okay. I would argue that's depressing economic growth and costing us jobs.
So when the debt commission comes back this fall and has a 2-to-1 cut in spending and a $1 increase in taxes, you'll oppose it?
I'm a member of the Debt Commission. I'm working with my colleagues.
But if the proposal is for $2 in spending cuts and $1 in tax increase, you're going to oppose the majority position on that.
I don't think it's good for him to do table talk. What's on the table or off the table in the debt commission. I'm hoping we can put a really good dent on the problem.
Well, I'm with you on that. Thank you, U.S. Congressman Joe Crowley of New York and Paul Ryan of Wisconsin.
Morning, Savannah.
You looked almost giddy when you banged that gavel yesterday and voted on this tax reform. I know you've worked on it for a very long time. And by far, the biggest tax cut here, the cut in rate, is going to corporations. Their tax rate goes from 35% to 21%. As I understand your argument and that of your colleagues, you're counting on corporations to take that money they now have and plow it right back into the economy, hire people, raise wages. It doesn't work if they don't do that. Is that correct?
No, all the studies show us that that is exactly what does happen. But first of all, Savannah, don't forget that we tax American corporations at the highest rate in the industrialized world. And as a result of that, we're losing jobs. We're losing jobs overseas. And more importantly, American businesses are becoming foreign companies. They call them inversions. And so we're seeing a rash of U.S. companies relocating overseas for lower tax rates.
Right, and this is what you're trying to fix. So the rate goes down.
That's right. So we're trying to fix that.
The
So we wanna
idea
get
is,
that-
yes, that the
That's right.
corporations will then spend the money on their workers, on jobs, that kind of thing, correct?
But we also say to corporations, not only are we going to let you bring your money back from overseas, which is trapped overseas, we're going to tax you at a rate that is on par with the rest of the world.
Gotcha.
But we're going to give you an incentive to invest in American jobs and American businesses. You can write off your investments if you do it in America by hiring more people when you purchase new plant and equipment. So we are convinced, and the studies are really clear, workers benefit, wages go up, more jobs occur, but most importantly, we need to put the American economy in a better competitive position so that we can compete and win jobs and get faster economic growth. But don't forget, this is a big tax cut for families as well.
It is, and I want to get to that, but let me just jump in on this because, again, the biggest tax rate cut is for corporations. And the problem is a lot of CEOs have said, really candidly, I'm looking at a list of CEOs who said, we don't plan to reinvest. What they're planning to do is to do stock buybacks, to line the pockets of shareholders. Let me quote Michael Bloomberg, a billionaire, hardly an enemy of business. He said, CEOs aren't waiting on a tax cut to jumpstart the economy, a favorite phrase of politicians who have never run a company, or to hand out raises. It's pure fantasy to think that the tax bill will lead to significantly higher wages and growth. I'll ask you plainly, are you living in a fantasy world?
I would compare that anecdote to just the surveys of businesses like the National Association of Manufacturers surveys, which show the vast majority of businesses are going to do just what we say, reinvest in their workers, reinvest in their factories, pay people more money, higher wages.
Let me pin you down on that, though.
The data is really clear, by the way. Workers benefit from this through higher wages. It's not a question of if, it's a question of how much they benefit.
And I'm jumping in on this because it's so important. So forgive my interrupting, but I really want to drill down on this point. The Wall Street Journal recently had a conference of CEOs, and Gary Cohen, the White House economic advisor, asked them, are you going to reinvest this money if tax reform passes? Let me show you what happened.
If the tax reform bill goes through, do you plan to increase investment, your company's investment, capital investment? Just a show of hands, the tax reform goes through? Okay.
Why aren't the other hands up?
Why aren't the other hands up?
Gary Cohen saying, why aren't the hands up? And the fact of the matter is corporations are already sitting on a ton of cash. They have record profits, $2.3 trillion. Why aren't they raising wages and creating jobs now?
Guess right. About $3 trillion of that cash is trapped overseas and cannot come back into our economy to be reinvested because of our tax laws. So you remove these barriers to investment in our economy. You give businesses an incentive to invest in America, in their factories, and that's exactly what we do. So look, Savannah, the tax rate before this bill passes is 35%. That's the highest in the industrialized world. The rest of our competitors tax their companies at about 22.5%. Canada is 15%, Ireland's 12.5%, England's 17%, China's no higher than 25%. So when we tax American businesses at much, much higher tax rates than our foreign competitors are taxing theirs, we're losing and they're gaining. And what's more important, American businesses are moving overseas. They're not even American companies anymore. This is a trend that has to be reversed. And we know that if we fix these tax laws, we will get reinvestment back in this economy.
Let me
you
ask
can point
you
to these anecdotes, but I will just tell you, every study under the sun shows us you lower the tax rates, make us more competitive, you will see faster economic growth in America.
And a lot of people are going to be counting on that and hoping for that very outcome. Let me ask you about the deficit.
The average tax cut for the median family of four in America is going to be $2,059. $2,000, if you're living paycheck to paycheck, is a serious tax cut. So what we're trying to do here is give relief to hardworking families, give relief to Americans. We're doubling the child tax credit, doubling the standard deduction, lowering rates across the board. We're making it so simple that almost 9 out of 10 taxpayers can do their taxes on a form like a postcard. So the point we're trying to make here, Savannah, is we need faster economic growth. We need to help people who are living at the margin, who are living paycheck to paycheck. That is good for America. The other thing you need to do, and you rightfully point this out, in addition to getting the economy growing faster and getting people in higher paying jobs, is we got to control our spending.
Yeah.
That we have more work to do. We clearly have to go after spending control, but you also have to have economic growth. Those are the twin things that get the debt down. Grow the economy, cut spending. This will help grow the economy. Then we got to get back at cutting spending.
So let's get at what we're talking about. I just fundamentally disagree with the premise from which you come, and we all know that, which is I just don't think you can sit in Washington and micromanage the U.S. economy, micromanage it through the regulatory state, micromanage it, economic redistribution through the tax code. What we want is a pro-growth economy that is internationally competitive. We are no longer in the 20th century where we're the undisputed economic superpower. We're in the 21st century. So our tax rates matter. Now, here is where we might agree. We believe, just like the Fiscal Commission, which I served on, I didn't vote for the final product because it didn't do anything on health care, but we believe broadening the tax base and lowering the rates. What does that mean? That means getting rid of tax expenditures. That means getting rid of what you call spending through the tax code. I have a different take on how you describe that. More importantly, though,
we're talking about the same
I
thing.
don't think we should sit around in Washington and pick winners and losers in the tax code through tax expenditures. So in exchange for that, let's lower our tax rates so we have a more competitive tax system. But here's the point. This is not trickle down where we think that some rich guy sitting on a yacht is going to just maybe spend money to help create jobs for people. What we want to do is remove barriers to growth. We believe in the characteristic of equal opportunity, upward mobility, and economic prosperity based on an entrepreneurial free enterprise climate that helps businesses get created, that helps people get more prosperity.